Hello, everyone, and welcome, and thanks for waiting. I'm Shelley Caroline, MICE co-director, and this workshop is called Translating Nonfiction into Genre Fiction, Writing True Experiences from Fantastical Situations. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a minute to thank our co-presenters for this program, Butterfly Festival in Beijing, and Priya's Shakti Comics, which is an augmented reality comic book featuring India's first female superhero. MICE is produced by the Boston Comics Arts Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit charitable organization that funds comic arts festivals, individual artists, and educational programs for the greater Boston community. If you like what we're doing here, please consider making a donation today by going to micexpo.org/donate, and that link is also in the description below this video. We welcome you to ask a question or leave comments for our instructor today. The chat is open, and we will be having a Q&A session at the end of the workshop. And how about we have everyone introduce themselves, say hello, maybe tell us where you're watching from today. We'd love to know who we're drawing with. And if you choose to work along with us today, you can also share your art using the MICE photo booth. We've included that link to the photo booth in the description below as well. Just click attach a file to upload or take a webcam photo of your work, and we'll be looking at those images later in the workshop. I'd like to introduce our instructor, Andy Santagata. He is a cartoonist based in White River Junction, Vermont, and a graduate of the Center for Cartoon Studies. Andy loves to write and draw comics about teen angst, friendship, and supernatural phenomena within the YA and new adult genres. Andy is best known for his autobio comic, Trans Man Walking, and the webcomic American Spirits, Freelance Ghostbusters, and his upcoming debut graphic novel is titled Jed the Undead. Thank you, Andy, and please take it away.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Shelley.
Yeah.
Sweet. So, hello, everyone. This is my first time doing it on Zoom, so I'm going to try to make as much eye contact as digitally possible. So, the goal of this workshop is to kind of get you guys flexing your storytelling muscles, thinking outside of the box, and coming up with as many ideas as possible, and ending up with an actual functioning story model. So what we're going to be doing today, if you'll direct your eyes to my super cool sheet here, is we're going to take sort of the seed of an idea, which is your nonfiction. We're going to extrapolate that into all kinds of attributes, and eventually kind of come up with a synopsis based on this formula. Don't worry, I'm going to go through all of this like slowly. So the first thing we're going to do is do a very short exercise where we're basically going to figure out what seed of truth we want to start writing our story from. So this could be like an actual literal event or moment that you want to discuss, like something important that happened to you that you just can't get out of your head, or a concept, which could be something as vague as like experiencing microaggressions, or something as specific as we need to raise the minimum wage to $15. Or it could just be a statement or something that doesn't necessarily have a direct meaning, but it means something to you. Like you could just want about like write about the rain, or perhaps just yourself. So what we're going to do here is take 1 minute to write one sentence or less about what we want to write about. So I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to use a really obvious example, and that is feeling isolated during quarantine, because I feel like we all have a lot of ideas about that, and we can probably come up with a lot of metaphorical sci-fi and fantasy ideas about feeling trapped in spaceships and or towers. I'm going to give you guys a couple seconds to spend some time thinking about what you want and just coming up with a completely succinct sentence or idea about it. Camera to the right, like this. Like this. Excellent. We got a little continental drift here. All right, so now you should have a sentence or a subject written at the top. So here comes the fun part. Basically, I have 3 rules of brainstorming when it comes to brainstorming in general, and they are as follows, as I organize my notes. The idea of brainstorming is basically to not edit yourself. When you're coming up with ideas for stories or just trying to throw things off the wall, I find that people seem to shut themselves down before they really, come up with anything that they like. You don't have to come up with anything perfect. The idea is that you just want to throw things out there, no matter how silly or wild your idea is. You want to write it down. You don't want to do a quality check while you're coming up with ideas. What you want to do is just try to come up with as many ideas as possible, regardless of quality, because that quality check comes later in the editing process. And the third thing, which is kind of more of a tip, if you find yourself saying, what if, maybe not, forget the maybe not part, write down the what if part. That's probably important to your story. So what I want you guys to do for the next 10 to 12 minutes, and I'll do this along with you, is try to come up with as many attributes as possible from this sentence. Now, what that means is coming up with concepts, feelings, settings, and basically anything you can think of that relates to that sentence that you want to include in your story. If you look at the little supplemental sheet that I have, I've got some ideas to kind of get you going. Like, since comics is a visual language, you might have a scene that sticks in your head that you really want to include. Like for me, I just have this image here of my cat just lonely staring out the window, being my only companion. But don't you think that makes for two good panels? So what you want to do is brainstorm not just visuals, not just things that come basically from it, but feelings that you have. You want to do textures that you want to include. You just basically want to throw anything and everything at the wall and try to fill that box within 10 minutes. So loosen your mind and let's see what we can come up with. And I'm also going to point out some ways that you can, my document here, point out some elements you can include while we start brainstorming there. So let me open up the supplemental handout that I gave y'all today. If you see the elements to include section, there's a bunch of ideas of things you might want to start thinking about when you start brainstorming your elements for your story. So right at the start there, I've got feelings, which seems really obvious, loneliness, but also kind of acceptance of things that are happening, maybe a little bit of fear, maybe a little bit of calm before the storm. That's just kind of brushing the surface of it, right? As for concepts, that's kind of more of like, abstract ideas. And when we're, thinking about the quarantine, we're probably kind of thinking of the idea of obviously pandemics spreading, but more so kind of an inside separation. You can really go abstract with this stuff like concepts like separating the outside from the inside if you feel like that sort of thing is important to you. And then there's the more obvious stuff like visuals, characters you want to include, events or moments that feel important, little things that you feel important, but you don't know why. Like for some reason, I keep watching King of the Hill over and over again in quarantine, and I'm sure that means something. Character details, clothing, outfits, songs that you remember. So let's spend the next 5 minutes of these 10 minutes filling it out together. As for my list, I'm going to keep going down this kind of rabbit hole here. Almost all the stuff that I bought during quarantine was from IKEA because cartoonists don't make a lot of money. So I'm like super familiar with this really specific cheapy kind of fake cotton texture. You know how when you buy curtains and you can see through them, but not really? I got to figure out a way to write that down on this list. Remember, even if it doesn't really seem important to write it down now, it might come up later. Just collect as many thoughts as you can. Words or dialogues, emanata and places. Let's see. I used to live in this tiny studio apartment that was literally shaped like this. But now my apartment is shaped like this. So I feel like it's kind of an upgrade. I also think that using some of these spaces might make for some pretty interesting quarantine comic panels. You'll find that some of this stuff actually starts to come together as you're throwing it at the wall. All right, so that's your 10 minutes. If you want to continue writing or just kind of wrap up what you're doing now, that's totally cool. I am going to open back up my slideshow to make sure everybody is doing good. There we go. All right, so once you've like filled out that box and feel like you've kind of got your first buckshot of all the things you want in the story that may not make a lot of sense, what we're going to do is go through this list and try to organize these completely disparate thoughts into something that makes some amount of sense. So in order to form a coherent story for a comic, you need three things: setting, characters, and plot. Now, ideally, the first two things drive the third thing. So if you've got a good enough setting and a good enough characters, ideally, they kind of tell you what is supposed to happen or feels like is natural to happen in your story. So what we're going to do is go through this list and pick out all of the words or descriptions that could give you an idea of setting. So you're going to want to go through and look for notes about ambience, maybe descriptions of items that you have written down, temperature and weather. Just go ahead and identify all of those by underlining them so that you know those are descriptive words for settings and that you can use that. So I'm going to go through here and try to figure out what applies to my setting. Obviously, this image. I feel like the outside-inside separation could also apply to a description of setting. The description of the curtain texture for sure. And I don't know about the apartment layout thing. I know it sounds literally very much like a setting, but I don't think it feels descriptive enough to describe the setting of the comic that I want to go through. This side? Okay, so can you see the whole like block right here? Oh no, yeah, it's blank. Cool. Okay, so once we've identified all of the elements in your box that have to do with your setting, you're going to want to look at your chosen genre of the sheet that you grabbed first and try to think of archetypal settings that would apply using all of these elements. For instance, if you have highlighted a lot of elements that include like wide open spaces or agoraphobia, you might want to think about how a outer space setting would fit with that, or maybe like a Ant-Man type of a thing where everything just seems far too large for you if you're using the sci-fi sheet. So what I'm going to do here is start making a list of trope-based settings based on the information that I put down here in my box. So I've got sort of this outside-inside separation. We've got my teeny tiny cat sitting in the window looking lonely, even though she's not the only one at home. And we've got sort of the see-through texture thing. So if I was doing a sci-fi sheet, I'd probably immediately start thinking of like, those classic tropes of what if humans are the aliens? And, if when you get abducted, what if you get put in one of those human zoos like in Rick and Morty or any given sci-fi scenario where that happens? That kind of emphasizes the us and them and also the inside-outside separation. Like if I was writing a sci-fi story, because I'm getting all these ideas now, you could do even like a Bubble Boy style thing, which seems a little bit literal, but instead of using an actual disease, that setting could be, you could use your imagination to find out. So here we are with fantasy. The first thing that springs to my mind with the separation of inside and outside is the super classic princess trapped in a tower, princess trapped in a tower thing. So you've got isolation, it's kept away from people. So I'm going to write towers. What else? Outside, inside separation. Dwarves, hear me out. In most fantasy stories, dwarves, travel underground and they're considered a separate fantasy race than humans. Therefore, there's already kind of a built-in thing. If you consider fantasy stories like The Witcher, all of the fantasy races are kind of colonized by the humans, and therefore there's kind of this inbuilt separation with not only visually, but also metaphorically and physically. Like the creatures in The Witcher are often pushed to like actual separate locations than the humans. So you can kind of play around with that idea. So go through and kind of see what you guys can come up with as far as a settings list. Give y'all a minute to digest all of that. Once you're starting to feel a little bit happy with your settings list, we're going to go through and do the same thing with your box of elements for your characters. This might be a little bit easier. Just like we did with the settings, we're going to go through and try to identify descriptors for characters for your story. Now, we don't have to be like super literal about it. It doesn't have to be traditionally people performing actions in your story. If you feel like your story is an ambient story, perhaps the main character in a way could be like the space station itself if you're running sci-fi. You know how people say like New York City is a character in and of itself? Imagine writing that, but good. Sometimes your characters aren't actually literal, especially when you're considering a visual medium like comics. So before we jump the gun here, we're going to go through with all these elements and circle the ones that we feel like could apply to those characters, whether the characters are actual personages or another protagonist that may not even necessarily be human. You probably have a bit of an idea of where you're going with this by now, but you can definitely develop some. So I'm going to go here and circle all the things I think could describe or apply to character or characters within this story. Most of this is going to be like really obvious, like if you have names, actual character archetypes, clothing descriptions, or people that you want to include, but some of it might feel more abstract. You might find that certain words or of feelings or concepts give you an idea of a character archetype that might appear in your chosen genre. So I'm going to go through here and circle my character words. Loneliness, acceptance, fear. You know, I think that's about it for my tiny list here. Over here, I'm going to make a character list. I'm going to start racking my brains about what fantasy archetypes of characters could possibly fit these selected descriptions. So obviously the first and the third kind of makes me think of some sort of hermit wizard, being that wizard characters who are hermits in fantasy stories are frequently choose to be alone because they either hate society, don't fit into society, or have some sort of weird crackpot anger against society because society doesn't care for magic. Another example probably could be like an Alistair from Dragon Age type character, like, I accept my solemn duty of being a knight even though it is so lonely and I cannot relate to anybody. Especially if you have a sort of initiate type of a character into a knight's order in a fantasy story, which emphasizes the loneliness that they would feel by going into a special order, the acceptance they would feel by being initiated into the order, and possibly the fear of what might be to come next. So rack your brains, combine these things, think of things that include some or all or just a little bit of your character attributes, and see what you can come up with. At this point, usually the story kind of starts to come together in and of itself. So if you feel like bending your characters or your genres a little bit to suit it, totally cool. And once you've come up more or less with the list of characters that you think would fit these archetypes or that might be interesting to appear in your story based on those lists, we're going to do the final part now of the preparation, which is your plot. So you're going to have a list of remaining words here in your little box that don't necessarily describe anything visual that's going on in your comic and don't necessarily describe the setting, which is also a visual element. You'll find perhaps some actions, some emotions, and some concepts left. Filter through those and see if you can identify any readily available events or moments, or perhaps some combinations of things that remind you of action tropes that happen frequently in your genre. So I'm going to go through and do what I just said. Anything that isn't a description of something that could count as a visual or could fall under the plot category. So that kind of just leaves these two things here. I'm going to draw a box around them so I can distinguish them. I've got my calm before the storm and my terrifying pandemic spreading, both of which are considered actions. I super don't want to be literal here with this fantasy pandemic story, but I am going to copy down these two things because I consider them to be important actions that happen in the story. So I've identified these elements and shall write them down here. It doesn't necessarily need to be a pandemic that spreads. It's more of the idea of, you know, spreading from a patient zero. Like all those people who started to dance to death in Germany. Pandemic spreading. Fantasy is a ripe genre for lots of medieval horror too. Pastoral horror, I think they call it. All right. So take a moment to identify these things with your plot. Sometimes you might find some leftover feelings that you kind of want to include here. Like, I really want to emphasize the isolation part of this story, for instance. So I'm probably going to double down on that. Okay, take a second to make sure you've kind of like got all the things you want to have on your list here. And then we're going to do the magical part, which is stringing all of this together into a story that makes sense. I did the super smart thing of printing out my lesson plan and then placing it all over my desk, which... Oh no, that was only supposed to be a joke. I actually didn't. Here we go. All right, now that you've kind of got your 3 lists of important things, you'll notice at the bottom here, I've included a sort of a rubric for a synopsis. This seems deceptively simple, but it's not. It's only a starting point for figuring out your story. So over here, we've basically got your 3-sentence starter structure for figuring out a plot. Subject is a description of the subject. When thing happens, action is taken to deal with thing. In the end, insert ending for your story here, which is a result of the action happening. I've simplified it even further over here if you'll look at my 3-act structure. You've got your setup, you've got your conflict and action taken, and you've got your final result. So for a fantasy story like Lord of the Rings, your setup would be, you know, Frodo gets handed the ring, conflict, ring summons ring wraiths, action taken, Frodo takes the ring to Mount Doom, final result, chucks the thing in Mount Doom, happily ever after. You can break pretty much every 3-act story down this way, which means that you can start writing a more complex 3-act story from a very simple seed. So what I want you guys to do is look at this 3-sentence structure, look at the genre elements that you've pulled out of your box here, and take a generous amount of time, 15, 20 minutes, to try to come up with, mix and match these elements in ways to come up with synopses that you feel like are good. Let me repeat that. Take this rubric and try to come up with as many sentences or versions of your synopsis as possible. Like, try not to get the perfect sentence right away, but try to write a bunch of different versions of the sentences. Try to fit them together to come up with stories that you feel like match up with your X statement. I had a professor in college that used to say your thesis statement or your X statement, which is your kind of platonic ideal of a story here, is called that because X marks the spot. It's supposed to guide you towards the core of your story. That's why I made you guys write it at the top. So if you've kind of been starting to write your little synopsis sentences and feel like you've kind of hit on your one true story, like Hermit A is a hermit who lives in a tower. When a horrible virus comes to town, he decides to cast a spell that enchants his tower in ice. In the end, he ends up being forgotten when the ice tower doesn't end up unfreezing, which I feel like is going to happen to me if I don't start talking to people outside of this quarantine. So if you feel like you've kind of got like this one true story, use your sentences as a starting point. Start adding some things in from your box or possibly from your little tool set here to build on that story. Choose the things that you want to include or that feel right. And when you've kind of got that 3-sentence basic, just start adding some sentences in there. So I don't talk you guys' ear off, I'll do the exercise along with you. Here I've got my setting that I've kind of become fond of here with the isolated tower. I've got a number of characters I could choose from, although if this is a story about isolation, I should probably just choose the one. I'm going to start doing some experimentation. Feel free to just like literally, physically put these elements together in a sentence and see if it feels right. So let's start here. I'm gonna need a name for a hermit wizard. I'm gonna name him Hizzard the Wizard. Hizzard is a description. Lonely old wizard whose only company is a cat with only a familiar for company. And then the other important element of the story is including the setting, here being the isolated tower. Who lives in a tower? So here we got your subject, your description, which ultimately comes together as your setup. It seems deceptively simple, but you can totally swap out subject with not just your main character, but the main subject of your story. If, say, you've got two main characters, but the real thing that you think is important about your story is the city that they live in, then you could say that, like, you know, the bazaar of made up city number 1 is a bustling place where our main characters live, for instance. And then let's do the next part, the conflict and action taken with young Hizzard, or old Hizzard as it were. So the conflict basically sets up the pins and your action taken knocks them down. Your subject is going to be the one taking the action here. So I've actually got the plot kind of all set out here after extrapolating it from the box. When action happening, this is basically the only action that fits into that box there. When I really should have changed pandemic to something. When a magical pandemic. When a pandemic begins ravaging the land, comma, action taken. So that would be the entire other thing, calm before the storm, the only action that Hizzard the Wizard actually can take from our data extrapolated here. So what would that mean for Hizzard? Let's see. The pandemic begins ravaging the land. Calm before the storm kind of implies that he takes an action that comforts him, but ultimately kind of screws him over, right? So I think encasing the tower in ice makes a lot of sense. He encases his tower in ice. And then we've got the end result. The end result tends to follow, like I said, if you've got your setting set, your characters set, and some hints as to what you want to do with the plot. You might find that some stories kind of start to come together at this point, or like I said, you'll find one that you particularly like. Now, I admittedly did a slightly crappy job with this pandemic spreading isolation thing. It's not really very fantastical, is it? If I wanted to rack my brains and actually turn this pandemic spreading event into something fantastical, I'd have to probably flex my muscles a little bit more. Now, lots of pandemic type spreading events in games and stories that come to mind include, like, you know, the classic in horror. You've got like kind of a zombification thing. You've got like magical plagues. You can do a lot with that. And I know it sounds very literalist and one-to-one, but ultimately when you start with these basic tropes of building blocks, you know what part of them you want to use because it sounds right, and you know what part you don't want to use even though other people have. You kind of can't figure it out until you really put them together. So here I have with my basic story about Hizzard and plenty of extra stuff to add in here. Perhaps there could be a second character, an initiate of the Knights Templar, much like our Alistair here, who tries to visit Hizzard, but he is turned away, thus emphasizing the whole isolation theme of the plot. You can really mess around and do a lot with stuff here, but the goal is to try to like turn all of these things into something that makes sense. So after all of that, you hopefully should have a synopsis based on the genre that you chose that comes together with a story. So that's basically the gist of how to use the worksheet. The idea of it is that you can kind of swap out the genre or kind of just use your own style, not think about it so much, but use different lenses to examine your X statement to see what kind of stories could apply to that. So I've been talking for a while, so I should take a second and see what you guys have come up with so far. If you have any synopsis ideas or cool, like, sort of genre tropes that you've thought up with that subvert your seed of a statement here, anybody want to share? It's cool if not too. Sometimes stories are squishy.
We don't have anything coming in the photo booth yet, but they can find that link in the description if they think this is a good chance to share progress on their work.
Sweet. Yeah. So the idea is that you can swap this sheet out for any one of the other genre sheets, and using the exact same X statement and filling out your box in the same way, you can apply the lens of your genre to all of these kind of ideas. So you can kind of come up with a bunch of different ways to look at the same problem and figure out what part of that speaks the truest to you as a writer. So if I wanted to do the exact same thing here, using the exact same ideas for sci-fi, this is what I would do. So illustrate my example. I think I can do this just so I can see what I'm doing. Taking the same ideas. And remember, you don't have to just like literally write down words. A lot of comics writers tend to think in images or visuals more. I definitely have scripts where pages are just like, literally, they just look like this. But I know what it means, and that's what's important. So I'm just going to really quickly copy down this list and then perform the same process for a different genre to sort of illustrate all the things that you can do with this like brainstorming technique of finding a synopsis. Now, I'm much more of a sci-fi guy than a fantasy guy, even though I am a big fantasy guy. But let's see here. Outside separation. Now you can sort of like use this classification identification process for any brainstorming of a story you do, like going through and identifying elements that would help you describe your environment of the comic that you want to include would kind of help you narrow that down. Going through and finding descriptions of characters tends to help give you ideas of characters you might want to include. So let's do the same thing here. First thing you're going to want to identify is brainstorm some settings. So let's see. I kind of want to take this in a different tack and try to include some of the emotions in my setting ideas this time. So I'm going to include loneliness and fear, and a lot of the stuff overlaps. Some of the settings tend to inform your characters and vice versa, and literal descriptions of the settings like the texture. So let's try to like put all these elements together in a sci-fi setting rather than a fantasy setting. So how would all this stuff fit together? As you're looking at your own sheet, I'm imagining that you're also like trying to write down your settings. Loneliness, fear, and calm before the storm just kind of screams abandoned in space to me. Which, if you think about it, there's a ton of sci-fi stories that actually use that example. The most obvious one being 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the main character doesn't tend to ends up not being as abandoned as he thinks he is, and that ends up being the scary part of it. You could do sort of a last one left on a space station type of a deal. With loneliness, isolation, and that kind of sense of like uncertainty, you could even do like first person who unfreezes out of a cryopod and doesn't really know what's going on. So I'm going with mostly a space theme with this stuff because I feel like space engenders more of that loneliness and fear rather than other sci-fi settings. But if you feel like these words come together in a different way for you, you might come up with a different set of sci-fi settings. So moving on, because I have a rather short list, I'm going to do the same with my characters and try to stretch my genre muscles a little bit and think of some characters that might fit with some of these archetypes. So I'm going to double up. I'm going to add loneliness as a character descriptor. I'm going to, what else describes characters here? Mostly the emotions. We've got our loneliness, we've got our acceptance, and we've got our fear, and everything else describes either the setting or is an action that happens. Now, as I said, a lot of this stuff kind of informs each other. So your characters might be informed by your setting, which in this case, it kind of is. If your setting is, abandoned space station, then your character probably is either the sole survivor of the space station or the first guy to get unfrozen, or a lone scrapper who's come across the station floating in the distance and he's the only one there. It really does inform each other. So let's take a look at our box and the things we've known so far and come up with some characters that seem like they would fit into this form. And I write down some of the stuff that I already came up with just now. So we've got our first guy to get unfrozen. Oh, shit. And if you ever get stuck trying to come up with settings or characters or things, you'll find that there are a lot of things to refer to back in your box. If you can look through your box and kind of think of existing stories, not just comics, but television, music, movies that include some of these elements, coming up with that list might help you jog your brain about some tropes that you might want to include. And if you know that those tropes seem kind of cheesy and you don't want to do them, then you'll know exactly how to change them because you'll know what to cut out. Let's see here. Back to my characters list. And in space, last month was space station. I could probably stretch my muscles a little bit more on this one. Loneliness, acceptance, and fear, science fiction. Well, hey, I'm kind of like restricting myself to human characters here. So perhaps this one could be, the main character could be like the sole survivor, or it could be like a Doctor Who type of a scenario where you're the last one of your kind alive, but you feel kind of guilty because you lived your kind out, which would be a pretty great plot point. So I'm going to write last survivor of a crew. So the point of this specific part of the process is to just kind of open up your brain to trying to find patterns in the genres based on your emotions, which sounds more complicated than it is. So, and then now we finally do the parts of the plot. So we'll do the same thing that we did before, where we identify emotions and events, moments, and actions. Sometimes there'll be actual things you want to happen in the story. Sometimes they'll just be forces that kind of like imply what's going to happen next, like I said. So the core concept of the whole being scared of a pandemic thing is, it doesn't really need to be specifically this pandemic. If you're trying to capture the idea of like immutable spread, that would be different than trying to capture the idea of like, something much more serious like a fear of death. So you kind of got to figure out what you personally feel like you want to write about. In this case, I kind of want to keep it a little lighter, so I'm probably going to go with the whole spreading part rather than the pandemic part. So I'm going to copy down this part where it says calm before the storm, though, because I think that's still important to my X statement here, the thing I actually do want to write about before the storm. And then instead of writing pandemic spreading, I'm just going to write spread. So this already kind of gives me a bunch of ideas when it comes to figuring out how all this stuff could fit in. Some of it seems like pretty clear cut, like when you combine last one left on a space station with last survivor of a crew with calm before the storm. That kind of comes together in itself as a story featuring, last survivor, something terrible is about to happen to him. And, the way sci-fi goes, things probably don't go so well. But by understanding that that's kind of a common trope point, you can mess with it to try to match that fictionalized synopses that you have with the spirit of your original nonfiction statement. So let's see here. Characters. So I'm probably going to do a 2001 style thing where we've got the final survivor. But you know what? As you're going through this and fitting things through, the idea is to kind of like keep things true to your X statement by using the elements that you've extrapolated from your box. I don't necessarily feel like Final Survivor really reflects my experience of being isolated during quarantine. It honestly feels more like we're all the only survivor in a bunch of identical spaceships, which means I kind of got to go back and try to find one of these things that fits my original idea some more. So that's what I mean by like mixing and matching elements of the story. Kind of go through and feel out what feels right, not by trying to word it out in your head, but trying to physically put your words and ideas together to see how they fit. So I'm going to change this up a little bit. One of many humans left alive. You'll notice that this kind of became the description. So subject could be our literal main character. Main character. I'm going to call them main character for now. One of many humans left alive, our description. That's not enough of a description though, because we want to finish the setup. Is abandoned alone on a space station. Now that setup really does feel like it rings true to my original, like, you know, X statement here. So the next part is to do the conflict and action taken. When conflict happens, our main character takes an action. So the conflict here is kind of spread out. There's some sort of like spreading thing that would enable that would disable our main character from doing what it is that they were trying to achieve. Let's see. If we don't want to do like a pandemic spread, we could do like an upcoming ice age type of a thing, or we could do like, you know, an impending armada, or we could kind of go with the War of the Worlds thing. If our main character wasn't human, perhaps it's an inevitability that they would, you know, encounter another alien race where they could acquire a disease from them, for instance. Very literal. But I don't want to go literal with this. Let's see. When I'm going to go with the Ice Age example. When the hull of the space station is cracked, the sub-zero temperatures threaten to freeze our main character, I said brightly. Okay, so that's the conflict. Our main character is going to freeze to death if he doesn't patch this hole in the hull as it slowly encroaches. The action taken, I'm going to go pretty basic with this, since the only other thing on my plot list here is calm before the storm. I know that he has to take some action that kind of calms him down, but ultimately kind of doesn't do anything. So I'm going to have MC takes. Now, what would kind of imply the sort of lack of connection that our main character would have here? MC takes the last of the repair materials to fix the hull. In the end, if this was a hard sci-fi story, he'd freeze to death. But in the end, what I kind of want to happen with regards to my X statement here is for our main character to become reunited with those other humans. So I'm going to tweak the actual story here to be more reflective of my X statement in the end. Because while I usually write like super depressing stuff, I'm kind of in not a super depressing mood lately. In the end, before he can freeze oh, I've run out of space. I'm going to go over here. A group of other humans finds him and takes him to rejoin society. So as you can see here, I kind of took like a super basic rubric and turned it into a slightly more complicated story. If I really wanted to flesh this thing out, I would try to read between the lines and try to include more of my box elements with my story about my poor main character who was about to freeze to death, but then was reunited with his fellow humans. I would probably include this specific cat moment as maybe like the main character having like a little robot friend that he can't really talk to, but he likes to imagine what he says, which is one of my favorite sci-fi tropes. I mean, like, I'm a sucker. BB-8 is adorable. By now you probably should like have kind of an idea of how you can move things around and figure things out and plug them into a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Because I think a lot of the stuff becomes apparent when you shut your editor mode off when you're brainstorming and turn it back on when you're trying to arrange things. So, yeah. I'm gonna give you guys a second if you've come up with any cool synopses again, or any ideas that you've had about genre tropes that you could subvert to reflect the truth more. If not, then I'm gonna go into my kind of like debriefing speech.
Yeah, we have a lot of great ideas coming in.
Yay!
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I'll read some over to you. So, one, short, sweet. I have an idea that is pretty much the story of Brexit set in space. That's from Rob.
Nice.
Betty says, my character is in a post-apocalyptic snowy desert and wants to go out for a smoke, but there are no gas stations, etc. left, so she has to ride on her magical cat to go explore the ghost towns for smokes. I relate to this. Okay, great. And Ned says that there's men alone in space after a mysterious disease wipes everyone out, and that's just space opera time. Mm-hmm. Nice. And Colin's got, okay, let me try and get this. So I have a sci-fi idea where dystopian government forces their citizens into romantic relationships, and the main character is lovers who hate each other, and which is punishable by death. They're almost caught by the government agent, so they kidnap him and try to figure out how to get out of the situation. So nice. Lots of interesting things coming through, and we also have a couple of things in the photo booth if you want to take a look at that. Oh, sweet. I love how speculative everyone is getting. Mm-hmm. We've got one from Victoria. What do I want to talk about? Wanting to escape brackets vicariously, which I think we can all relate to. We've got, let's see. Oh, this is very, very cool. So Victoria here is using the sci-fi model and has listed a bunch of like awesome influences. And she's got her character list with full-on names for characters and descriptions. For her character, she's got a human character and an alien character, and the human's character's name is Shanika, and the alien character's name is Lionel. Her setting, she's got a list, Earth, space, or an alien planet. And then down at the bottom, she's gonna kind of consolidated that all into this plot. Shanika is a Black woman who lives on Earth. When an alien randomly visits her planet, he offers her a chance to come live on his home planet, brackets, after mentioning what his world has versus Earth. In the end, she makes the conscious decision to go with him, which, in my opinion, totally reflects your ex statement. I love it. We've got one from, oh, this is awesome. We've got some art from H. Antonio, which I super dig, and I wish you all could see. Can you see this? Yes, you can. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Looking great. Oh, love your inking. And you guys have any more? That's my 2 slides there so far. That's what's coming in, but yeah, we're also encouraging people to start asking questions if they've got them before. Sweet. So when we wrap up, we can go through a Q&A session. Okay, I've actually got some questions for you guys to think about if you want to sit with your plots for a while and kind of want to like work on that and develop them a little bit. So let me break out my postmortem over here. I don't know why physical paper was ever invented. Here we go.
All right, so you probably noticed that while you were writing your story from your X statement, it was maybe either a reflection or an evolution or a change. So my question for you guys is this. If you wrote down your story, what's the difference between your literal nonfiction story and your fiction story? Do you feel like that your stories evolved as you wrote them, or that they have similar themes to your original story? Do you feel like they captured what you wanted to write? And does the genre fit it? I have all of this written down in your handout, so if you ever want to like ruminate over your story and poke at it and try to fill it out some more, you can go through those questions. If you wrote like the same nonfiction statement in different genres, it would be a cool thing to like go through and try to see if one genre fits your nonfiction idea better, if one just kind of came easier to you, what the differences between the two stories are, and whether they kind of like evolved to be their own thing. I always think that you never know what a comic is about until you're done writing it. So I think that's a pretty good guiding principle here. You might find that you end up with something that maybe even explains your original concept to yourself a little bit better. So yeah, that's my little debriefing speech. So I'd love to answer any questions y'all have or check out some more of your synopses. And whoop, there we go. So yeah, y'all got any questions?
Yeah, Andy, I got a question for you. So sometimes I only have like big ideas, and that's like things that would be for like epic storylines. But if I don't have time to actually do these things, do you have any advice to kind of reel in if I just want to get started on it, or what I actually want to just encapsulate it in a shorter story or comic?
Totally. So if you've got like your big epic world that exists in your head, but you can only or only want to like write a shorter moment of it, I would choose just a slice of the world or one moment in time. Instead of trying to like capture the whole story and encapsulate it into something short, I would pick kind of like a vertical slice of something that's important in your story and just do that part really, really well, to the point where it kind of extrapolates what would happen outside of that story when you read the short story, if that makes sense. Like pick a small part of it and then flesh that out really well. I think that by choosing like shorter moments in a very literal sense, is probably the way to go. Because that way you can have a super fleshed out world within a tiny number of pages.
That's great advice.
I have the same problem. I want to write like 300-page books, but
yeah,
I want to write 300-page books.
And I've always heard the advice that I shouldn't start with something too epic because, it just kind of weigh you down sometimes. You need to get some work done.
Yeah, you want to kind of like start by greasing the wheels a bit, but you can always string together shorter comics to make a longer one too.
Yeah. So Sierra wanted to share that I'm thinking of a story about a space postman carrying packages, but delivering them into chutes in spaceship and not able to see each other because they're very lonely. That's great. I really like that because I think a lot of us are being encouraged to stay in touch with one another right now, in whatever way possible. Write little notes or text people.
I think the space post would be super important.
That's great. And I can get you a couple more samples that are coming in on the photo booth, but I'll just need a sec.
Sure. Take a tea break. The space post thing is cool too, because then you can use like vacuum tubes, all that cool visual stuff. Oh, they're coming in. I did this whole exercise with my partner earlier, and by the time I was done, they were like, so I started in the horror genre, and now I just have this teen epic. And I'm like, yeah, that's awesome. That's the point. Ah, there we go. Sweet. So we've got, my computer sucks. There we go. We've got a sci-fi sheet filled out. And ooh, I'm gonna check this stuff out here. So our X statement is I'm so bad at reading handwriting. All right, so we've got our characters, which are Johnny Hollow, which I think is a super awesome name for a character. We've got, oh man, can I zoom in using the slides at all, or? Okay, that's cool. All right, I really dig the illustrations on this one as well. So we've got like actual visual examples of like stuff to include in the comic. We've got this super awesome like heart with the vessels. We've got our horned main character over here, and legit awesome concrete plot points that fill in down here, which is rad. Man, you guys are doing some cool stuff. I'm like peeking down here so I can like actually read the slides. I really,
And
yeah.
I can sort of fill in some things. Yeah, Johnny Hollow story. He gets swallowed up by a, I believe, mountain and meets an underground creature. And yeah, I think it gets his heart. I don't know if that, gets the heart of the creature or gets heart broken. Who knows? Yeah. But well, that's all represented here by this awesome creature and that rad heart and those crystals.
Oh yeah. I'm telling you, visual notes.
It's a great idea.
Oh, I see. Actually, stalactites is included in the settings, so that's neat. Oh, I see how you came up with the cape. That makes a lot of sense. Rad.
Mm-hmm. So there's another comic coming in as well. Next slide.
All right, I'm going to read this one aloud. It's been months since the world went up in flames, and strangely, I don't feel grief or pain or loneliness. I just want to smoke. Let's go. Slam. Totally the winter wasteland gas station list time. Oh man, I once went to Michigan back when I used to be a smoker without a pack for a wedding, and I just remember sitting there being like, yes, I'm very normal and I'm not thinking about going outside in the snow at all. I feel that. Also, I really like the cat. I really dig like kind of literal ideas of like genre ideas taken like seriously. Like I love Meg Mog and Owl because Meg's a super literal witch in the real world. That's what I dig about this. We got another one coming in. Ink wash.
Yeah, so Rob wanted to share a couple of pages from his comic Rat and Roll, and he describes it as a alternative reality about genetically engineered animals living among people in 1890s New York.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah, it's partly a commentary on how immigrants are treated and how societies can become segregated. So there you go. You can kind of do a different reality as a part of your fantasy or sci-fi like idea.
I love like the whole alternate history thing because you can do a lot of interesting stuff with that. Like just like this. Like I love Lackadaisy Cats even though it's cheesy, but I also love like, when people try to, oh my god, what's the story? I'll come up with the name of it. But yeah, I really like literalist interpretations of stuff when it's literal things like, like in Mouse, the mice are taken super seriously, or in X-Men, the mutants are taken in a very literal way, even though it still counts as a metaphor. I think it's neat. Also, yeah, that ink wash.
I'm definitely inspired too to actually come up with one idea and apply the same thing to, like you said, all the genres here. Try and do the same story as a sci-fi adventure, as a horror thing, or as fantasy, maybe putting them all in the same book. Maybe a wild time.
Yeah, I think you could come at the same thing from a bunch of different angles and kind of make that thing more, real,
Absolutely. So let us know if you have any more advice for us, or don't have any further questions coming in. So anything to wrap up?
Let's see. Well, I wrote all my little advice on the little handout. If you want to take home, your prompts for your for your elements that you want to include. I've got my brainstorming things, but I guess my number one piece of advice is making stuff up should be fun. Have fun making stuff up. A lot of us just kind of forget, especially when it ends up being our job, you know? Like, it should be fun to make things up. And if you're not having fun, then, you know, make up some stuff that is fun to you. I think that if you're having fun writing, people are going to have fun reading it. Everyone says that, but it's true.
Oh, wow, that's great. Especially now.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I don't like that I can end absolutely every sentence with like, oh, that's even more important now.
Well, just in these trying times.
In these trying times.
That should just be like my email signature.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Andy, and thanks everyone for coming and for flexing some creativity with us today.
Yes, thanks. I hope you guys had fun.
Yeah, thanks too for Priya Shakti and Bachara Festival for helping us co-present this workshop today. To follow Andy's work, visit Andy Santagata. So that's ANDISANTAGATA.com.
I should write that down.
Yeah, the link is right in the description and also on the slide we have here. You can follow him on Twitter at Suited Devil. If you need links to those printable worksheets or Andy's cheat sheet for this workshop, you can check out the video description, which has all the links. Thanks everyone from MICE and have a great weekend.
Thanks, guys.